Joining us now is Emily Kopp. She's a reporter at US Right to Know, returning to the program. Emily, it's so good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
Absolutely. So you were in the room yesterday with Dr. Fauci while he was being grilled before Congress. There were some stunning moments, I guess, to say the least. We pulled one of them here to get your reaction. Let's take a listen.
Do you agree that there was a push to downplay the lab leak theory?
Not on my part.
Really?
Really?
Wow.
Wow.
I think most of the country would find that amazing. I still got 11 seconds.
Well, look at the facts. I've kept an open mind throughout the entire process.
All right, I yield back.
You did not suppress the lab leak theory, yet in the past you have said, quote, it is a distortion of reality, unquote. You've said, quote, I've heard these conspiracy theories, and like all conspiracy theories, they're just conspiracy theories. That's what you told the American people. And so would you like to clarify what science were you following then versus now?
Yeah, no, I've also been very, very clear and said multiple times that I don't think the concept of there being a lab leak is inherently a conspiracy theory. What is conspiracy is the kind of distortions of that particular subject, like it was a lab leak and I was parachuted into the CIA like Jason Bourne and told the CIA that they should really not be talking about a lab leak.
Thank you.
That's the conspiracy.
Appreciate that.
All right, so Emily, you are, in my opinion, the preeminent reporter on the lab leak situation. So what do we make about the veracity of Dr. Fauci's claims there?
Yeah, I mean, to hear Fauci tell it, he had nothing to do with the fact that the lab leak theory was maligned as a conspiracy theory for years. And to be frank, continues to be maligned as a conspiracy theory by the hardcore Democratic partisans in my Twitter mentions currently.
Yes, that's right.
It just belies belief, and you can see it in the responses from the members of Congress there. Fauci is the most influential scientist in America, and the idea that scientists who raised an alarm about the potential for a lab accident in Wuhan and who raised concerns about the papers in favor of zoonosis, the wet market theory, could have been maligned for years, and that this narrative could have persisted that the zoonosis theory was sacrosanct and not to be questioned, could have persisted if the most influential scientists in America had truly an open mind for years, is just really absurd.
Right. And so let's actually take a step back, because one of the best work that you have done is the FOIA and revelation of a lot of these documents and the internal discussion. So definitively, how can we prove that what Dr. Fauci is saying there is blatantly not true? Take us through the paper trail that you've been able to discover.
Sure. Yeah, I think at this point I've written like 30,000 words about this, based on documents FOIA'd by me, by another independent journalist, Jimmy Tobias, and through subpoenaed records that the committee obtained, showing emails and Slack messages that show that the authors of that paper were saying very different things publicly and privately at the same time. And I actually mapped those statements over time. And there was no willingness by Fauci to consider that his participation in this paper, in its prompting and in reading drafts, basically reading over the shoulders of these virologists who were writing about the possibility of a lab leak early in the pandemic. There was no willingness on his part to consider that his influence, his power as the head of NIAID, which oversees billions of dollars in research grants, was inappropriate. That in itself, even if he didn't directly edit the paper. I think if you know, as the virologist who wrote that paper knew, that NIAID, Fauci's institute, had funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan, and you know he was reading over your shoulder, you have an enormous incentive to only accumulate evidence in one direction. And that is what is borne out by the FOIA emails, by the Slack messages that were subpoenaed by the Congressional committee. And the virologists even described one of the core concepts of their paper as crap. And it was, in fact, ghostwritten by one of the most infamous gain-of-function virologists of all time, Ron Fauci, who they internally described as unbelievably conflicted. So they put out this paper, put their names on it, not really believing in one of its core concepts, and that happened after they participated in a teleconference with Fauci, this, giant in science and someone who oversaw their funding.
Wow.
How they make their livelihood.
Yeah, it's so stunning. And one of the things that you've always done a great job of is that Dr. Fauci and a lot of the scientific community and the media now at this point would rather call this a conspiracy theory and effectively cover up their own complicity in this question than actually answer to the 1 million or so people in this country who died, from this, or at least, whatever. You can describe the deaths in whatever you want. At the very least, we know it was, a couple 100,000 at the very minimum of people who died from this disease. And from your reporting, as we know from last time around, it is almost certainly a lab leak. And yet, we see all of this effort in Congress to change, for example, the definition of gain-of-function research. So could you describe a little bit of that to us? Because Fauci, in the estimation of a lot of scientists, has committed perjury by trying to change the definition of gain-of-function research. Did he stick to that in his testimony when you were there? And what is exactly his excuse?
He did double down on the false claim that NIAID did not fund gain-of-function research in Wuhan. But I actually want to address your first point very briefly.
Yeah.
I think the main takeaway from the hearing yesterday should have been that Fauci oversaw probably the most catastrophic policy failure in modern history, which is the exportation of high-risk virology to an adversarial country, a secretive country, that did not have adequate protections against airborne viruses. But the main takeaway that I had sitting in that hearing room yesterday is that no bureaucrat should be the head of a federal agency overseeing billions of dollars for decades upon decades upon decades like Fauci has, because his influence in Congress, in the press, in the scientific community really comes across because he keeps making these false statements with apparently no consequences. And so, as you were saying, he, I believe, committed perjury by continually conflating gain-of-function research and this other term called enhanced pandemic potential pathogen. So in order to conceal the fact that he lied to Congress in his exchanges with Senator Rand Paul in 2021 when he said his institute never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan, he said, well, that's the general understanding, and my more technical, sophisticated understanding as a scientist is enhanced pandemic potential pathogens. So gain-of-function research refers to enhancing any pathogen in the lab. And enhanced pandemic potential pathogen refers to enhancing a virus that is already very dangerous, very deadly and transmissible.
Got it.
And the gain-of-function research that was occurring in Wuhan certainly meets that first definition. There was no general understanding of gain-of-function research when those exchanges with Senator Paul happened. No one had ever heard of it. So the idea that Fauci is now retrospectively applying this term that did not exist at the time the experiments were approved, it's like he thinks that he can bend space and time through his power as the former head of NIAID, which I think is sort of perverse because at the same time, he's not taking accountability for those projects having been approved, despite his signature being on them.
Right.
So on the one hand, he thinks he can redefine regulatory frameworks single-handedly in order to cover up his perjury, but also take no accountability for what happened in Wuhan. And that's just inexcusable.
Yeah, you're right. Because as you said, it was probably one of the single greatest policy failures ever in modern history. To take your example of why bureaucrats shouldn't be their power ever, what do we all remember about J. Edgar Hoover and about people who amass vast power in the federal bureaucracy with unaccountability as they commit atrocities? And then it's only after they're gone, some 30, 40 years later, that we can be like, oh yeah, that was a real problem. By the way, the last time that we checked in, it was basically case closed. We were checking in on the zoonosis theory. There was they moved completely away from bats, and now we were on to pangolins. So I wanted to check in again. I think it's been like 6-7 months or whatever since we last spoke. Where are we currently now in terms of the zoonosis theory? What are they still grasping at, or do they not even try now at this point to justify it?
I think to some degree, the attitude in the press and the scientific community is case closed, but in the other direction, that the wet market theory is infallible. And in fact, that's been their
from the beginning.
approach since February 2020, before we had much information at all with the publication of Proximal Origin, that paper I was referring to earlier. There have been criticisms of the two landmark papers in science that were championed by the New York Times as sort of a case closed for the natural origin theory.
Right.
There have been critiques of that by people who are experts in spatial statistics, that the idea that early cases cluster around the wet market is based on bad analysis. We already kind of knew that the data was compromised because there was an early focus on the wet market that could have biased the data, and because there's so much censorship in China around that early pandemic period. So we already knew that the data was pretty sketchy, but recently papers have come out in peer-reviewed journals suggesting that the analysis applied to those data were also sketchy.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's even more bunk than we had originally started out. Where can people find and support your work, Emily?
You can find us at US Right to Know, or you can follow me on Twitter, Emily A. Kopp.
All right, we will have links down in the description. As I said, the preeminent reporter on this subject. In my opinion, she should have won a Pulitzer Prize. But, you know, it's the country that we live in. So, Emily, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.